Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Thank you, Teresa.
It is great to be back and doing another show. We took a week off, although our listeners won't have known that because we're working just a little bit ahead. But I missed doing our show recording last week. So
yeah, me
it's
too.
good to have you back in the studio.
Good. Well, last time we were together, we were talking about wars.
Yes,
and
we were.
We got a couple other wars. I mentioned at the end that we're going to have a war with a very strange name. I need to say a few things about.
Okay.
And it happens in 1739, and it broke out between England and Spain, and it's entitled The War of Jenkins' Ear.
Okay.
Jenkins was a captain in the English Navy, and on the side he was also smuggling.
Oops,
yeah. And he got caught by some Spanish revenue officers. Well, okay. What they did was they cut off one of his ears, and they handed it back to him and said, go take this to your king, because if your king were here, we'd do the same thing to him. Well, he went back to England. He had his ear in a little box, and he presented it to Parliament. And sometimes machismo is not the wisest thing to do. The English reacted by declaring war over an ear.
Okay.
It was just punishment. He got what he deserved as a smuggler, but nonetheless, probably they could have dealt with it in some other way.
Right.
And certainly not have made such an issue of it. But Spanish authorities did what they did. And so that was this brief little war between England and Spain. There's a much more serious war, however, that pops up, and this is called the War of the Austrian Succession. Mm-hmm. We've already seen the War of the Spanish Succession. Now it's a question of the Austrian Succession. And it has really very little effect here in North America, with one exception. Okay, but outside of that, it doesn't have a lot of effect here. There is a fortress at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River.
Okay.
And this fortress is practically impregnable. At least the French thought it was. And it's called Louisbourg. And believe it or not, it fell, but not to the British. It fell to a ragtag bunch of New Englanders. And frankly, the story is that most of them were drunk by the time they took it. And they were aided by the English fleet, but nonetheless, they pretty much did this on their own. They were very proud of this, as you can imagine. But it has consequences, because when the peace treaty was signed between Britain and France, in exchange for property that the British had lost in India, they turned around and they gave Louisbourg back to the French.
Okay.
New Englanders were very upset about that. Drunk or not, they took that fort and they wanted to keep it.
Right.
And so that's something that's going to be in the back of their mind. Now, this is 1748.
Okay.
But within another 20, 30 years, this is going to be serious stuff, and the loss of Louisbourg is going to come back to haunt the British. Now, what really is important for our story here is that there are two colonial movements that are moving toward each other. It's almost like plate tectonics.
Oh, okay.
And a quake is inevitable. Mm-hmm. On the French side, what you have is a plate moving from the old Great Northern Crescent. Remember that croissant that ran from Quebec up the St. Lawrence River to Fort Frontenac, through the Great Lakes, then either the Wisconsin or the Illinois River, down to the Mississippi, down to New Orleans. Okay. The French wanted to shorten that up, and so this new, smaller croissant would run from Quebec up the St. Lawrence River to Lake Erie.
Oh.
Okay, rather than going all the way to Lake Michigan, to Lake Erie, then there would be a little portage to the Ohio River, down the Ohio River to the Mississippi to New Orleans.
Okay.
Now, that does a couple things. For one thing, it cuts off all of that stuff in the north. Remember how important Peoria was going to be?
Yes.
That makes Peoria basically irrelevant. But at the same time, it's easier to communicate between Quebec and New Orleans. Okay, much faster doing that.
Sure.
It's going to build the Ohio River Valley as an important spot, but it's also going to bring the French several hundred miles closer to the English. And that's the other plate, because what's happening is that the English colonists feel that the 13 colonies are overpopulated. And
wow.
Yeah, right. And they're going to move over the Appalachian Mountains and then begin coming down into the Ohio River Valley. So there's going to be a clash between the two. They're going to run into each other. You can't help that. To help protect their route, the French set up a series of forts along the Ohio River. First of all, on the Allegheny, there's a fortress that's set up there. The Monongahela River, there's another one there. These are paralleling the Ohio River, but just directly to the east of that, so they're protecting the Ohio River. There is another fort, the Fort Presque, Fort Presque Island on Lake Erie itself, Fort Le Boeuf, Fort Venango. This is on the confluence of the Allegheny and the Monongahela. And then further down south, there's another fort that's going to be established a little bit later on, and it's going to be Fort Duquesne. Okay. We know of it today as the city of Pittsburgh.
Pittsburgh, okay.
Yeah. Well, now this is a direct clash with the English that are coming in the other direction. And if you look at old colonial maps of the 13 original colonies, especially the earliest ones, what they show is a north and south boundary that separates the colonies themselves. There is no western boundary.
Okay.
So theoretically, Virginia would run
all
the way across to the Pacific Ocean. Now,
Okay.
they weren't thinking that far, but they certainly were thinking about the other side of the Appalachians, which are, not impassable mountains by any means.
Right.
And so they begin looking at that. Virginia, certainly North Carolina, Pennsylvania, New York, all of them are looking westward and thinking westward. Well, in 1749, some land speculators, and especially Virginians, began securing land grants west of the Appalachian Mountains. So the English government is giving these grants to these speculators as much as 500,000 acres
Oh my gosh.
of land on the other side, on the west side of the Alleghenies now are given to them. And in order to press the ownership, the governor of Virginia commissioned a surveyor. This was 4 years later, so this is 1753. Commissions this surveyor to go over the Alleghenies to look at the land, but then specifically to warn the French not to press their claims, but to back off.
I'm assuming that's not going to be received very well.
No. In fact, the French responded by building Fort Duquesne.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is at the confluence of the Allegheny, the Monongahela, and the Ohio River, so it's a really strategic spot. The surveyor's name, George Washington.
Oh.
You heard
Here
of
we
him.
go.
Yeah,
I've heard of him before,
go.
somewhere.
Yeah. A year later, Washington returned. He was sent west, and this is in 1754, sent west over the Alleghenies with a force of 150 Virginians.
Wow.
And their intention was to challenge this new fort and to force the French to tear it down and to leave the area. Okay. Well, 40 miles outside of away from the fort, there is a clash of arms. The French fall back, taking some casualties. Washington makes this statement at this time, and it's, I guess, typical of young men of the era. Now, battlefields are incredibly dangerous to human flesh.
Yes.
At that time, they weren't quite as bad.
Okay.
And so he said this. He said, "I heard the bullets whistle, and believe me, there's something charming in the sound."
Oh, yes, that would be a different perspective on...
Yeah, there's nothing charming nowadays.
No, I can't even begin to think of anything charming about the sound of
a bullet coming at you.
At your ear.
Right. Yeah. But, keep in mind that if you're 100 yards away from the guy that shoots at you, there's a very low chance of you actually getting hit.
Right. Yeah. That is one difference in our technology today, I would assume. That makes a huge impact on battle.
Well, what happened was that as Washington was rejoicing in the whizzing of the bullet sounds and all that, a larger French force returned and drove him away, all the way to a spot where his men set up some breastworks and they tried to defend themselves. So here they are surrounded. He called it Fort Necessity. And
I've seen that.
Have you?
Yes.
Really? Neat. Well, anyway, there it was, and the battle went on for about 10 hours, and at the end of it, the French paroled the whole Virginia force, Washington and all. They were very honorable about the whole thing, but this meant that the Virginians had to go back over to the other side of the Allegheny. They had been beaten. The date was July 4th, 1754. Interesting date.
It is interesting that it would be July 4th and 20-some years earlier.
Later, yeah. Now the fact is that powder and shot have been exchanged. The British become concerned. They know that there's another war going to be started. It's going to be a world war, and so this is when they made the decision that they were afraid the Acadians up north would stab them in the back, and so this is when they put the whole group of them and moved them down to Louisiana.
Okay.
And the Acadians became the Cajuns at that point. We talked about that earlier.
Right.
War became really global also when Friedrich II of Prussia, the King Friedrich, invaded his neighbor Saxony. He believed that in the archives in Saxony there was proof that there was some kind of a secret grand alliance against him. Oh. And so he believed that he could find this secret treaty that allied Austria, Russia, France, Spain, and Saxony against Little Prussia. Now, they had a great army. Prussians had a great army. There's no doubt about it. In fact, one visitor to Prussia said that most countries have an army. In Prussia's case, the army had a country.
It's a country.
But what happened was he invaded. He had to find that evidence. It wasn't there. And so as a result, he created a grand alliance of Austria, Russia, France, Spain, and Saxony against him. And now he was really in trouble. He needed an ally any place. And sometimes, the enemy of your enemy is your friend. And since the French and the British had already exchanged fire in North America, he turned then to the British and said, "Would you like to be my friend?" And the British said, yes, as long as you're an enemy to the French, we'll be more than happy to. So now the British were friends, but this also meant that not only were the British his allies, but also there's a tiny country in Western Germany called Hanover. And they also became allies to the British and the Prussians. They go, what? Well, the fact is that by this time, the British monarchy had run out of Englishmen to be kings, and they had invited in some distant relatives. A guy came in by the name of Georg, and he took over. He was actually from Hanover, George of Hanover. He becomes King George the First.
Oh, okay.
And so the first, second, and third are actually Hanoverians.
Okay.
In fact, King George the First and King George the Second never spoke English.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, they were the kings of England, but they had to have translators. Well, this war spread, and as you can see, it started in the Ohio River Valley. It then burst out in Saxony, and then it began spreading all over the world, throughout Central Europe, in the West Indies. There were naval fighting contests over islands. In the Philippines, there were battles way over on the other side of the world. In the Philippines, in Africa, naval fights all over the seven seas.
This is really a First World War.
It really was. Yeah, it really was, because it was just about everywhere. Manpower, British manpower was spread very thin. And the British, when they looked at North America, they wanted to coordinate the 13 colonies into what you could call an intercontinental congress.
Okay.
It's the British. This is a British idea. So that the 13 colonies would cooperate with each other for British defense. Some of the representatives there took a look and said, oh, this is an interesting idea. Maybe we ought to be spending more time with each other. One of them in particular, by the name of Benjamin Franklin, is looking at this as an opportunity for unity and cooperation. And eventually the vision is one of home rule. That would be to say the 13 colonies would be independent of the Parliament, but that they would be loyal to the king. And that theory begins to develop in the 13 colonies itself. Well, less than a year after the disastrous invasion of the Ohio region by George Washington, he comes back again, this time as second in command. Okay, this time there's a force of 2,000 men.
Wow.
Yeah, and these are real soldiers. Besides the colonial militia, there are regulars there, and they have a professional general at the lead. This is General Braddock.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, well, Braddock is 61 years old. He's been trained in the art of European set-piece battles. I guess he could do pretty well out on a field somewhere in central France or, central Germany or whatever. But the Ohio River Valley is not Central Europe. And so he's trying to fight a
French battle.
Yeah. And so it's going to be a huge disaster. The French and Indians fought like French and Indians, The colonists themselves did not want to fight in this European style, but Braddock was in command, and so he lines up all these colonials in straight lines and forces them to fight like that. Well, they got mowed down. Just like the Braddock's regulars did. His regulars are using a musket, a smoothbore musket, with an effective range of around 60 yards. Okay, at 100 yards, like I say, it's pretty hard to hit something. At 60 yards, you could probably hit a man. Okay. But the French and the Indians and the American colonists, they're using hunting rifles. That is to say, rifles. So the bullet itself, when it emerges from the muzzle, is spinning.
Okay.
And it gives it a stability way beyond the smoothbore. So the effective range there is about 120 to 140 yards.
Oh, so
that's
twice.
Bad news, yeah.
Yes.
So instead of marching right up like the Europeans would, one against the other in lines, the French and Indians are standing at a distance. They're up in trees. They're behind bushes. They're behind rocks, wherever, and they're firing at this much greater range. Now, a rifle takes longer back in those days because they're all muzzle loading.
So
It takes longer to load, but nonetheless, it's much more accurate at a much greater range. And if you know how to do this in simple tactics, it's devastating for the side that doesn't.
Right.
And that's exactly what's going to happen to Braddock and his regulars. Washington himself had 2 horses shot out from underneath him.
Wow.
He had 4 bullet holes in his coat. So much for the charm of
I was going to say, as my thought instantly, I bet that wasn't as exciting anymore.
Yeah, I had to get those back home to Martha to sew back up. Braddock himself was mortally wounded. And so, as a result, the force fell to George Washington. Washington began an orderly retreat. And, military people will tell you the most difficult maneuver in battle is an orderly retreat. It's the hardest thing to pull off because the tendency is to run.
Hightail out.
Yeah, and that's a real disaster. But if you can retreat well, you're doing good. And that was George Washington's greatest skill as a military leader was retreating.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well.
And he had to do it an awful lot.
Oh, okay, well.
But later on. But anyway, what happens is that as he gathered his men together, what they literally did was they buried Braddock, and all the men and wagons and horses and everything literally walked over his grave. And the reason for that was to pound it down, and then also so that the French and Indians would not be able to find it and to desecrate the body.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That would have been something they would have done.
I don't know.
Okay.
To tell you the truth, you don't know. Yeah. I have to learn about that.
Interesting. I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay.
This whole thing is a disaster all throughout the West. You know, when Washington takes the remnant of those British and American forces back over the Alleghenies, there's nobody to defend the Western boundaries anymore. And even their allies, the Iroquois, went crazy. Washington had something like 300 men to defend all of Pennsylvania, Virginia, and North Carolina.
Wow. That's a lot of land to cover with 300 men.
It's impossible.
Sure.
You know, and as a result, especially with the Iroquois going on rampages, nobody was safe. They were coming in, they were scalping the American colonists as well, who were supposed to be their allies. There's a case in which some colonists were as close as 80 miles from Philadelphia and were captured by the Iroquois and scalped.
Ooh.
You know, that's getting kind of close.
Yes.
So it looked like, at this point, the French and Indians had saved the Ohio River Valley. They had been twice now successful in repulsing the British invasions. So the little crescent of the Lake Erie and Ohio and Mississippi, New Orleans, seems to have held.
Right.
And if the war ended at that point, everything would have been fine from the French and Indian point of view.
Somehow I'm assuming that's not what happened.
I'm afraid you're right. Yeah. Yeah. Instead, what happens is that the war lingers on for 2 more years, and there's still more fighting that's going on in the Ohio region. And in fact, those 2 years look really good from the French point of view, because not only do they have their normal allies in that area, but also the Osage here in Missouri sent forces all the way over into the Ohio and Pittsburgh, right into Pennsylvania.
That's a pretty good hike.
It is, and it says something also about the relationship between the French and the Osage.
Yes, it does.
You know, they're good partners. We're going to see this later on with the Choteaus and Laclede himself, and so the Osage really throw their lot in with the French as true allies, and they're great warriors too. So that's a real big help. In fact, they were part of the defeat of Braddock's men. Okay, they were there for that battle. 2 things change, and both of them are done by England that are going to change the tide of war. Okay. And the first is that the leadership in the war effort is going to change. They have a new prime minister who comes in, and his name is William Pitt. Okay, so one could imagine then that after Fort Duquesne falls to the British, it's now going to be named Pittsburgh City, or Pitts City, Pittsburgh, yeah. It's named after him. He decides to shift the strategy from fighting in the Caribbean. Instead, go all the way up and begin fighting on the St. Lawrence River Valley, going right into that area there. What that's going to do is this. He's taken a look at the previous war. If you remember, the French had given up Hudson Bay and Newfoundland. Yes. Okay. And remember, Acadia becomes Nova Scotia. So the British, especially after they get rid of the Cajuns, now control that upper area. They also control the 13 colonies. So now there's like a vice that begins to close in on the St. Lawrence Seaway. And that's his intention to do that, to crush them in between. The other thing is he purges the Army and the Navy of what he calls the Braddocks. You know, he wants young, energetic officers, risk takers, people who are going to think outside of the box. Right. Okay. And so that's what he does, and that's what he finds, and he begins promoting these. Louisbourg fell again in 1758. So far, that's the only victory the British had in the entire war. You know? Okay. And then he sent a general, young general, 32 years old. Okay, remember Braddock was 61. Yes. Okay, this is James Wolfe. Wolfe, and he sends him with an army to attack Quebec itself. It's an audacious move. Wolfe had been a officer in the British Army. And remember, he's 32 years old. He'd been an officer in the Army since the age of 14.
Oh, my gosh. Wow.
Yeah.
So
those things happen. You remember Auguste Choteau was sent by Laclede to found St. Louis. He had a force of about 30 men working underneath him. He was 14 years old, too. So, it's it just goes to show you.
Wow. Yeah, times were different. Can't imagine a 14-year-old now doing that.
Really?
But,
yeah. Well, Quebec is very well protected.
Uh-huh.
It's got fortifications on the north side, the east side, and the west side. The south side, you don't need to have fortifications because the St. Lawrence River is way below, and there's this huge rocky bluff that goes up, and there's no sense in defending that because nobody could climb that.
Okay.
Yeah, well, you know it. Uh-huh.
Never say never, right?
Never say never, and that's exactly what Wolfe did. He sent a very small but determined force. They scaled the sheer cliff, literally hanging on to trees, to bushes, to crags in the stone, and carrying with them nothing more than just rope.
Okay.
And when they got to the top, then they
pulled it up.
They sent that rope down, and they held on, and then the whole army went up, literally crawling up those ropes. When they got there the next morning, when the French realized what had happened, the entire British army was right there on the Plains of Abraham.
Oh, my gosh.
The French attacked. They didn't do too well. And in this battle, both the British commander, Wolfe, and the French commander, the Marquis de Montcalm, were killed in that battle.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But the British won the day. They took the city of Quebec, and then all throughout the winter of 1759, 1760, they were repeatedly attacked by the French Canadians, but held on.
Oh, my gosh.
And so now you have a situation in which the French are really in...
They're really squeezed.
They really are. They're really in bad shape now.
All right. Well, we're going to learn more about that next week.
We will, yes.
Thank you so much, Father. Can we close today with our prayer?
Yeah. Divine Father, shower your blessings upon us, upon this radio station, all those who are listening in. Shower your blessings upon the city of St. Louis, which we celebrate now at the 250th anniversary of its founding. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Amen. Thank you, Monsignor.
Okay.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.